So today or tonight, I have a few takeaways for you. Number one is for you to see that geographic boundaries may be too limiting when identifying Rosemaling, and that it is more beneficial to maybe identify a painted piece by the painter rather than the district. And of course, to see some pictures and to learn of the Rosemaling from Numedal. And if you are a Rosemaler, I hope you see a picture that inspires a future creation. So where is Numedal? Numedal is where this big red pointer is. It's closer to Oslo, obviously, than it is to Bergen, but it is a valley and is considered to be in the eastern part of Norway, and it is surrounded, and it's part of the county of Buskerud and is surrounded by Telemark. So if we look a little bit closer, Numedal stretches from Kongsberg in the south all the way up to Uvdal in the north. And this whole region all around here is Telemark, with Hallingdal up in this area, and then the Hardangervidda is to the west. The Numedal Valley is known as the Valley of the Middle Ages because it has the most timber buildings that date to the Middle Ages, and that also includes 4 stave churches. During the Middle Ages, Numedal was on the trading route between East and West Norway, and throughout the valley, you'll see buildings with symbols that are carved into them that date back to the Middle Ages. And some of those symbols that were carved are like the 6-petal leaf, and to just as a protection symbol. And you'll also see that same symbol throughout, not only throughout all of Numedal, but elsewhere. The use of those protection symbols were used, and back then they had meaning that has lost to today. So, a thought. In the book Folkekunst, Håkan Graffer Livland, who is one of the contributors in that book, wrote that previous art researchers, namely Øystein Vesaas, and he's the one that you may remember who wrote the 3 books on Telemark, Johan Meyer, who is also a much earlier researcher of Rosemaling, who is also an artist and an author, and Niels Ellingsgaard were not right when they said that the Rosemaling from Numedal could not stand on its own 2 feet. In other words, that Numedal was influenced by painters from Telemark and Hallingdal. Livland contends that it was really the other way around, that Numedal gave influence to painters in Hallingdal and Telemark. And another thought, perhaps, it can't stand on its own because it didn't have a regional look or style. But rather, the painting was so diverse that pieces needed to be identified by the painter, if that was even possible. So an example that Livland cites was the establishment of a royal school in which the likes of Telemark painter Hans Glittenberg attended, where he learned how to draw and to paint. Livland further laments that Numedal received little attention when compared to Telemark and Hallingdal. But thanks to people like Carol Bender, who has done a lot of research on a particular Numedal painter and offers an offering of classes, that it's changing. I do think we're going to learn that Numedal can stand on its own and make a mark in the Rosemaling world. So is there an identifiable regional style? Well, I kind of already given you the answer to that, haven't I? But anyway, Rosemaling from Hallingdal and Telemark and Viksdal and Nordfjord and Oos are generally easily recognizable. But it is harder to do so with styles such as Modi Romsdal, Usterdalen, and the style of the hour, Numedal, because they do not have a particular look. And that is what we're going to explore, the difficulty of identifying Rosemaling through or from Numedal, and how we really need to be looking at the individual painters. So how do you identify Numedal Rosemaling? So what I do is in order to learn the painting characteristics of a particular style or the artist from a valley, I do a lot of looking and studying of examples. I try to find books, pictures. The digital online museums are really a great help. And then I sketch all that I can of the artist's work. And I will keep all of those sketches and notes that I take about background color and colors used in the Rosemaling. And I try to learn from their flowers, their details, everything I sketch, and they're put in a notebook that I have on a shelf to my right. This is what helps me to learn. So where were they from? So like Telemark, where the painters can be divided between East and West Telemark, and Hallingdal has stylistic differences from Hul, Gul, and Ul. Numedal also has three regions where the painters originated, in Flesberg, Rollag, and Numedal Uvdal. And that there are also painters that came into the valley from Hallingdal and Telemark that also painted in Numedal and were influenced by and possibly influenced other Numedal painters. And if there's time, we'll briefly look at some examples of some of the painters, the Hallingdal and Telemark painters that came into Numedal. But keep in mind that sometimes when pieces are found and cataloged for a museum or an auction house, it is generally the place where they are found that is listed as the place of origin. And I think that has led to some problems where we think it might be one style and it really isn't. So an example would be the painting of Gunnar Bø. He is so much just his own style that he really cannot be called Modi Romsdal, even though that is where he was from. And I understand the confusion that it causes. So let's look at the Numedal painters from Flesberg. So here are the ones that are known. And we'll look at them one at a time and take a look at some of their work. And as you look at the examples of their work, try to see if there's any similarities in what, let's say, the star painter and Gudbrand Foss had in common or between any of them. But here's a clue. This will help you. Just don't spend a lot of time trying to discern that, because you're not going to find very many similarities. So let's look at the star painter. And it is thought that the star painter was one of the first decorative painters in the Flesberg area of Numedal. And most of the many, many bowls that were painted were all very similar. And there was some version of a star. The star that we see a picture of on the right is four-pointed, and the one on the sketch that I had done is six-pointed. But then the star motif is just not only in Numedal. It is found in Trøndelag, Telemark, Viksdal. But what makes this particular, the Stjernemålene, unique is is how that painter put all of his pieces on the right, the lighter red, orangey red on the right, what he used to make up his designs. And they were really quite simple. And as you can see, the piece on the left, that is from Trondelag. And yet it still has this star down in the bottom. It's a 4-pointed star. And then we have a couple of other styles of stars. We have another Trondelag piece on the right, on the left, and a Hallingdal piece on the right. So stars were not a popular, but they were a motif that is found in more than one region. Next is the Kongsberg painter. And there could be a whole program just dedicated to the Kongsberg painter. He, or possibly she, as some researchers believe the Kongsberg painter was a woman, is considered one of the most technically skilled painters of the time, and one of the most important sources of inspiration for many of the folk artists in the Numedal and surrounding areas, including Telemark. Excuse me. It is believed that the Kongsberg painter was professionally trained and perhaps at a royal seminary. And I have to admit, I don't know what that term royal seminary means. So if any of you know, I would love to hear from you. And it's possible that what I was reading was a poor translation. But you can see, compared to the star painter, this style is much more sophisticated. Here's another piece from the Kongsberg painter. And there were a lot of people who apprenticed with the Kongsberg painter, and their skill was so developed that at times on some of the later pieces, it's difficult to tell which was really the Kongsberg painter and which was an apprentice. The Kongsberg painter was known to have painted large interiors on big farms in the southern part of Numedal. And it was a Kongsberg painter who also used pointed, as you can see, really pointed tulips and long leaves, like we possibly can say they are a bit similar maybe to Valdres leaves that are usually in black and green. And this painter, as I said, had painted in large farms, but had the skill in order to do it, and was sought after by those who had money. And I also believe that this painter painted in the Kongsberg church. I'm not even going to try to say this person, maybe Hoymir Mullerin, was one of several anonymous painters from the Flesberg area. And this painter, there are similar painters who are, well, there's no one that painted exactly like this painter. And this painter loved the teardrop, or not teardrops, but dots. And, can you have too many dots on a piece? I'm going to leave that up to you. But one of the things that made this particular painter from this area, the Hoymir Mullerin, which is from a farm area, are these semicircles that go around these star flowers that look a teeny bit like a poinsettia. And I don't recognize any other painter of the pieces that I've seen. Now, I admit there's a lot more pieces that I need to see, but there's just not a lot out there to study from. This is another small cluster of unknown painters called Paul's Year de Mullerin. And it is felt that this painter was self-taught, and his name, the specific painter, Paul Muller, and his name is not known, but his name, he's given the name of the farm where he painted the clock on the right-hand side. And what we see on the right-hand side is a watercolor of the original clock. And I believe that was painted by Johann Meyer for one of his publications on Numedal. The sad thing about that clock is that it has been painted over, so it's lost to time. There are other painters who were influenced by this particular painter, but they are unknown, and in most cases, the researchers are not able to tell their work apart, but they can just tell there are slight differences in the way they're painted and in designs to know that Paul's Muller was probably the one who influenced a small group of painters from that area. Next is Hans Hansen Landa. And of all the painters in Numedal, it's probably Landa who painted the most naturalistic flowers in the Baroque style. He made this trunk on which he painted. As you can see, he used a dark blue background, and which was a bit unique for him. There's not a lot of pieces with that particular background color. He was a farmer and a silversmith, as well as a carpenter and a rosemaler. So in a sense, he was a real Renaissance man. And there are a few similarities, like his tulips, that look a bit like the Kongsberg painter. And it's possible he was influenced by that painter. We don't know. But he took whatever his influences were, and he made the style his own. And he has a very interesting script. And that's another way that you can tell sometimes a painter. The next painter is Svein Myhre, and he's also one of the important painters from the southern part of Numedal. He painted many trunks and cupboards and bowls, and his colors were usually the red that we see, or a really dark blue. And it is speculated that he was also influenced by the Kongsberg painter, but he continued to develop his own style. And the bowl on this slide shows his characteristic, more so on the right, his flowers that do resemble poinsettias. Now, this bowl, the way that this bowl is laid out is really similar to bowls that we have seen from Telemark, with the circle and a motif, and then some type of geometric between the circles. So the last painter from Flesberg is going to be Gudbrand Larsen Foss. And he's known for his really, really long center tulip petal that is the longest. And it kind of looks like a hand, but there's always one that is long. And this is taken from a piece that I saw in the Numedal book written by Niels Ellingsgaard and Gry Schar Andersen. So now we're going to move up the valley a little bit to Rollag. And here are three of the known painters from the Rollag region. So the first one we're going to look at is Ivar Gundersen Ustrud. And he was a wood carver, and he also did acanthus carving. But look at his carving on this havre. This was used on horses with the dragon heads. And really, it's very ornate. And look at this kana, this pouring pitcher, how ornate that this is carved. And the very piece on one of the very first slides that we saw was also done by him. But it's speculated that he was inspired by church art. And that kind of makes sense when you see these not dragons, but the lions. And I don't know what this scene is, but we have the lion, the royal lion here, and these faces, man and a woman. And he was just very adept. And on his Rosemaling pieces, and I could not find examples of his Rosemaling pieces, but he would use geometric borders, plants and animals and people. And he painted many objects like this. And here's a piece that we saw that he had painted, possibly made when we were at one of the farms on the 2014 folk art tour. Or this says 18, but this is 2014. Next is Kettle Hochheim, and his style I can easily recognize. It's very distinctive because in my mind it's a bit wild. He doesn't use roots. Things are not grounded to a root, and he has line work that goes absolutely everywhere. But he's the only person in Numedal to really paint like that. So you can't say that this is the style of Numedal, but it's the style of Hochheim. And he was one of the most productive of the folk artists in the valley, in and around Vegley, which is in that middle portion of the Numedal Valley. And he used a very simple palette. His background was usually a red, possibly a cinnabar red. And then you can see his painting was a Prussian blue mix with, they called it in the translation I read, royal yellow, which is, when I kind of played around with it to see what I could come up with, it's similar to like a Naples yellow and raw sienna mix. And this is what you see here. And this particular yellow is known as Chinese yellow and imperial yellow. And that's all I know about the yellow. It's not a yellow we use today. I'm not even sure that it's even being made. I'd have to further research that. But if we look at another slide with some of his work, these are some sketches, and it just shows you how kind of wild his stuff was. Now, if you can imagine then line work going every which way. He painted Hochheim. I can never say it correctly. Hochheim was an active painter for over 60 years. And in her thesis, Charlotte Litterud Anderson, who co-wrote the book with Niels Ellingsgaard and then also published her own thesis, wrote of him that he was the most interesting in the Rosemaling tradition of the region. And I have to say that, not that interesting means that he was the best. His style was just so incredibly unique. She said that he was one of the most innovative and always the earliest to adapt new ornamental ways of painting. And I think I have one more slide. Yeah, and here is a cupboard that he had painted, which is not as wild as some of his other work. His work is based on the Rococo style, and it's very abstract. This piece is a little bit more normal, but if you looked closely, you're not it's going to be very difficult to find the root of the design. So it's very hard, at least for my eye, to find a starting place, a resting place, and then follow out the entire design. He painted tulips that had very pointed petals, and he liked round roses, but he did it in an abstract way. She also wrote, or Anderson wrote, that he needed to experiment, and I think we see that in his work. That there are several pieces online and that we saw in the folk art tour, and they do each look a bit different. And I like that he needed to experiment. And I think that is a good thought for all of us Rosemalers, that we should be experimenting too. So the last person from this area is Ole Gunderson Kleverud. And he was from a family of painters. I think of all the painters, of the two other painters we saw, his stuff is probably the most predictable. And if I were to look at this piece, I would wonder, this could be from Telemark. But we know that he's really deeply entrenched in that area. His brother, he had a brother named Evan who painted chinoiserie. His cousin was the Rosemaler Kettle Hochheim, whose stuff we just saw, the wild stuff. And his brother-in-law was a Rosemaler by the name of Niels Kravik, and we'll see some of his stuff later. He was instrumental in the further development of the regional style that was based on what he did. And when you look at these flowers with the stripes, we're going to see that in another painter coming up. But I'm not to the point of saying that that's really uniquely Numedal. It's uniquely Kleverud and that other painter, but they're the only two that I know that paint like that. And I think this is really interesting. The scroll on the left, isn't that nicely shaped? And then I don't know what happened over here on the right. A little bit wonky, but it's fun anyway to look at. So here are the Numedal painters from Rollag and Uvdal. And there are a few more in here in this area, but I wasn't able to find a lot of pictures, or any pictures, so I did not include them. So the first one we're going to look at is Tore Kravik Vrena. And there's a bit of confusion because there are two Tore Kraviks. They were born and died close to the same dates and in close to the same proximity from the Kravik farms. And they both were Rosemalers. And this particular one, Tore Kravik Vrena, he was one of the first painters in the upper part of Numedal. We're now in the furthest northern part of the area. And he and his wife had 5 children, and his younger son was married to the sister of Kettle Hochheim, the man that painted all that crazy stuff. So you can see how much they were in close proximity and probably influenced one another. He was adapted as a Rococo painter, but this happened later in his life. And early on, he used a lot of Prussian blue, red, white, yellow, and green. And he did figure painting, with most of them being biblical. A lot of scenes by the early painters were biblical. And then here's another piece that looks entirely different that he had done. So here's a sketch and then the painted piece on the right. Next is Niels Kravik, who ended up immigrating to the United States. And he was known for his carpentry work, and he was considered to be very clever and creative when he made his trunks and cupboards and desks. And he probably was influenced mostly by the West Telemark painter Svajanung Svalastoga, who was the first Telemark painter to paint in Numedal. In fact, Kravik worked with that Telemark painter and probably learned quite a bit from him. His compositions, as you can see on this one, is typical in that it is asymmetrical and everything is held together with short stem lines. He used black line work to hold it all together. And Gry Charlotta Anderson wrote in her thesis that it was felt that when he immigrated to the United States, that Numedal lost one of their most prominent rural painters. Next, also from the Kravik farm, is this piece. And there's not a lot known about him other than it is thought, but it is not entirely substantiated, that he painted this cupboard that is in the Uvdal stave church. We can see, so this flower here looks like early Rafelka or Rogaland. And these two flowers held together with this really stiff scroll. Now, next is Sebjorn Kverdalen, and he is among my favorite Numedal painters. And if you are ever able to take a class or listen to a talk by Carol Bender about Sebjorn Kverdalen, do so. She knows more about this artist than most people. His style is unlike any other Numedal painter. In fact, I don't think he's like any other painter in Norway. It is sophisticated, clever, and his skills show that he had contact with the professional arts and crafts environment in Kongsberg. And as a young man, he did study with decorative painter Hovald Christopher Gorder. And it is speculated that Gorder also had contact with the painter from the Valdres area by the name of Petter Odnes. And they both, Odnes and Kverdalen, did do chinoiserie. I think Kverdalens are a little bit more developed than Petter Odnes. He also used gold leaf, and it's interesting. Typically, gold leaf is either a square or a rectangle, and this piece doesn't seem to be that. So I don't know if this is a piece he had left over from something, because as expensive as gold leaf was, it was always used as a square or a rectangle, so you don't lose any of the gold, which was so expensive. But his draperies are beautiful, and he had this really light look. I have one more slide, I think, of his work. Yeah, look at this flower on the left. It's just marvelous how he created that border to give that shape. And you can see an example of the chinoiserie on the right. But look at his strokes. They're so fluid. And there's such a feeling of spontaneity to his work. And his work is varied and it's imaginative. And I just don't think you see that anywhere else. He painted maybe one of the longest. He had one of the longer careers. He painted for nearly 70 years as a decorative painter. And the older he got, the more painterly, the more casual, the more free that his painting became. And he also liked to put birds, and I don't have an example of that, but he put birds in his painting. The next one is Halvor Persgaard, who is also another one of my favorite painters from Numedal. His colors are sharp and crisp, and I think we see a little bit of spontaneity here on the foot of the armbar, but really. He was not one of the most clever painters. And by that, I mean, he found a formula that worked for him and he just replicated it over and over and over. And but he was clever in how, I think he was clever in how he would put things together, and the use of his detail work on the left side on this white scroll. I just think that's wonderful. And he'd like to use these big black dots. And so we also know who did that, and that would have been Thomas Luraas from Telemark. So we're going to quickly go through a few other examples. This one we do know as a star painter, and I meant to take that out, so I'm sorry that I didn't. But a lot of all these pictures, or most of these pictures, are from the folk art tours, and they're not identified, but they are painters that lived were from Numedal. And one of the places that we went was a farmhouse where a partial wall was just full of bowls. And the one on the right is possibly painted by Ketil Hochheim. And we have a few more, another picture of bowls from that same room. This room was in the original farmhouse. This room was in the original farmhouse, and that is now used by this family that still live there for special occasions. And it's located on a working farm. And on one of the granary buildings, you walk upstairs, and there are 3 Sabjorn Kverdalen trunks up in their storage above in the granary. But this is where a family now lives. And I don't know how many generations have lived on this particular farm, but the people that are connected to this farm are connected to someone that many of you may know, and that's Darlene Fossum Martin. And I'm just putting this one in for fun. This was a Sevlatunet up in that storage barn with all the other trunks. And doesn't this look kind of Oss? But it's kind of fun and carnival-like. I just think it's a fun piece. And then this was on a trunk, and I think the stroke work and the dimension created is very, very good. I think, but I cannot say for certain that this was painted by either Sabjorn Kverdalen or possibly Hans Glittenberg. So those are all the Numedal painters, and I think at this point, are there many questions, Greg or Maddie?
So far, I see no questions in the chat. I think if we're nearing the end of the slides, I think. So if you want to power through and finish up, then we can do all the questions at the end.
Okay, then we're just going to, and now I don't have as much yakety yak. So here are the Numedal painters that were from Hallingdal. And some of them, like Lars Aslak Trageton, you probably know. We'll just go through them. So here's Gunhild Gard, Ola Oda, and this corrugated work reminds me of things throughout on the cupboards of Numedal. Here's Torstein Sand, and Sand is known for this kind of motif in the left. And here's Nasta Dokken, and this is a piece that is not in Hallingdal. I couldn't find a piece that he had painted. I mean, in Numedal. This was painted in Hallingdal. And here's Trogaton, who then moved on and over to Rafilka. Whoops, that was a little bit too fast. And then Tufto, very clever in his composition, very different, kind of like a mushroom in a way. And then next are all the painters from Telemark. And we have the Luraas brothers. All three of them have pieces that were painted in Numedal. They spent time there. And Sandviken, who then did immigrate, and his ancestors are throughout the Midwest. And we have Jeskelid. But again, when you look at their work, it doesn't really look like anything or any similarities to what we may see in Numedal, but yet they painted in Numedal. And then the Glittenberg and Boone, and then Jans Jordan. And then we have Ola Svalastoga, and I could not find any pictures, so I thought this would be a good place just to say the end. So,
well, thanks
it.
so much. That was, oh my gosh, that was fantastic. I want to say to everyone, we will be opening up for questions now. So if you have any questions to ask of Patti in these last 14 minutes of our webinar, now would be the time. But I saw one came in the first time you asked. You had used the term chinoiserie. Would you mind explaining what that is?
Chinoiserie is Chinese-inspired painting that was organic, usually done in either a blue or a blue-green, and it would have a tree and a stump, kind of a very simple oriental feeling of a landscape, but it wasn't a landscape at all. And if you let me know afterwards who that person is, I'd be happy to send that person some examples of it.
Of course. I think this is more of a clarifying question, but you said earlier that the painted bowls were still used by the family for special occasions. Were all the bowls just decorative, or were they actually used?
No, those early on they had been used. What was used, and to clarify, I probably misspoke. That farmhouse, that old farmhouse, is what's used for family gatherings. But I don't think they use. I know they use the bed, they use the cupboards and the old tables, but not the bowls. Early on, they would have been used for beer drinking, but I think they probably use glasses now.
Gonna jump in here. Were some of these in the Numedal Museum, or were they all farms, or were they all folk museums on this tour? Where did you get to see all these amazing pieces?
Farms and private collections. But I do know that in 2025, the plan is to go to the Numedal Folk Museum, which is in Kongsberg.
Amazing. And that's the 2025 folk art tour that you're leading, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So
sign up.
Earlier on, you did talk a little bit about your process of how you researched valleys. Can you go on a little bit more detail about how you go about learning about specific styles of Rosemaling?
Styles is, if it's a style, so let's take, for instance, Oos. There is the book about the Oos painters, but there are also a lot of pieces that have made it to antique shops and have been posted on eBay and on Facebook. And so wherever I find a picture, I have a hard drive, flash drive, let's say, just for the OS. And with that, I take those pictures and some of them I'll print off, some of them I'll just be having them on my screen. And I will sketch. And I don't sketch the design unless it's a design that I think is quite clever. But so in the case of Oos, I have pages and pages and pages of just the flowers, and then pages and pages of just detail work. And then the same for not so many, because there's not so many variations of scrolls. So I will take and I use sometimes a magnifying glass. I will also look in books. If there's a book out there, I will go through. So in the case of Numedal, when I was trying to learn the style many years ago, and that's when I realized it's not really a style, it's a district of these wonderful artists. So now I have pages of sketches from each of the artists. Yep.
There
now,
are. Sorry. There are a couple questions. Someone wanted to know if it's decided what are the dates of the 2025 tour? Has that been decided yet, or is that still being planned?
I think that's still being planned.
So,
but that would be that you would want to direct to Andrew at Vesterheim. That person. Or Rolf, I suppose. I'm just the yacker on the tour.
It would be Ralph. Looking at what we have on our website, we don't have dates planned quite yet.
Okay. I don't, it's going to be maybe late May, early June, sometime June-ish, earlier summer than later is my understanding.
Can you please share what the authors for the Numedal textbooks were again? I think some people missed that.
Yeah. So do you want me to put it in chat so people can see? Or the first one is Rosemaling and Numedal, and that's Nils Ellingsgaard and Gry, Gry, Charlotta Litterud Anderson. And then the second book is her thesis. And so her name, Gry Charlotta Litterud Anderson. And I believe that second book it's a newer publication, is or was available at the Vesterheim gift shop, supply shop.
I do see that someone has raised their hand in the attendees. Just letting everyone know that if you'd like to ask a question, you can use the Q&A function, or you can even put it in the chat. I don't want anybody to feel like they've missed out or anything. But I had a question myself. I was wondering, when you kept talking about all of these different painters in Numedal and how they all worked with each other, what was like, how did they get connected? Like, how did a Rosemaler in this region learn about this Rosemaler in another region, and they were able to work together, or they were influenced by each other's work? How was that, connection made? Do they know, or is that just something naturally that came up?
We think of, at least I thought of Norway as first of all, an isolated country. And they really had an active tourism trade back starting maybe 1850, if not earlier. And then in the case of the painters themselves, the Luraas brothers, they were like tumbleweeds. They went. Thomas Luraas was as far north as Stjerdal, north of Trondheim, all the way over to Bergen. And I think because Numedal was on that early trade route, it was visited. And because of that, the what was his Trogeton? He came down from Hallingdal, was in Numedal, and then we see his influence in the Agder regions. And then he finally settled even further west in Rogaland or Rifilka. And so I think there was just a lot of movement among some of the painters, and they would just come upon one another, I suppose.
It's really fascinating.
Go
Why
ahead,
do you
Maddie.
suppose these artists develop so uniquely rather than kind of having a distinctive style like other regions of Norway?
I don't know. I don't. And it's the same when if you were to study Mori Rumsdal, there's not a style, but you see influences there from Trondelag, Updal, and Gudbrandsdal. I don't know. I don't know. Maybe all the good ideas were taken, or maybe they were so individualistic they were not going to be influenced. I really don't know. That could be my next rabbit hole.
Be a good one to fall down.
Yeah, yeah. If someone has an idea, I would love to hear what that may be.
And then,
Go ahead, Greg.
yep. There's the question of, would you mind repeating the name of the museum in Kongsberg again?
I don't even know if I've ever said it. I have to write it out. Logsdal. Okay, it's Logsdal Museum, Lagdalmuseum, Logsdal Museum, and that's in Kongsberg or near Kongsberg.
Well, thank you so much. I think that kind of wraps up our Q&A section of this. I want to thank everyone again for attending, and a big, big thank you to Patti for such a wonderful presentation. I also want to give a shout out to everyone that worked behind the scenes on this, like our collections, exhibition, development, accounting, and communication marketing teams for all they do to make this possible. A recording of this presentation will be available on our YouTube channel soon. You'll also receive a survey right after this program in order to better help us serve you. We're interested in your feedback and appreciate your thoughts. Lastly, if you enjoyed today's program, please consider becoming a member or contributing a gift online. These programs would not be possible without folks like you. As we always say, you can't have a Folker at school without folks. Thank you again, everyone, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you, everyone.